Our guest in studio today is Abe Carrillo. Abe is a proud son of Mexican immigrants and proud employee at Herman Miller, where he's Director for Inclusiveness and Diversity. He joins us today to talk about his family's immigration story and about the good work that Herman Miller is engaged in. Abe, welcome to Feel Like You Belong.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Great. So, as I mentioned in the intro, your family is originally from Mexico. You were born in the United States, but talk about how your family came to live in the U.S.
Yeah, well, it really dates back to my grandfather, and he was part of the Bracero program back in the 1940s. So he spent several years working in the vineyards of California and other areas in agricultural, which was his background.
And so why was the government bringing braceros into the United States?
Well, this was back in the 40s, so as we know, the World War II was happening, and the U.S. had a shortage of labor. And male workers, and so the U.S. government created a program with the Mexican government to bring in young men to do a lot of the work that obviously our young men here in the U.S. couldn't do at the time.
Okay, okay. So your grandfather came here, and where were his children?
All of his children were, all 10 or so of them were in Mexico, working on the farm, waiting for Dad to come back home. After spending, he would spend 12 months working in the U.S. and would go back to his family.
Okay, and the money was good?
Good enough, but good enough to be that explorer and take that risk, right? Of someone that had never been to the U.S., probably had never left that little ranch in the mountains of Durango, and good enough for him to take that risk and be part of that program.
Sure. So, end of World War II. What happens to your grandfather?
Well, like we've seen throughout history, of course, the attitude kind of changed and the program ended, and they were no longer allowed to stay here. So they were basically asked to go back home. And thankfully, my grandfather worked for, among the employers that he worked for, one of them was Union Pacific. And someone there encouraged and guided and helped him to legalize, to become a legal resident of the U.S. And that allowed and paved the way for his entire family to become legal residents. And amongst his children, my mom became a legal resident at a young age.
Okay. Now, back in the 40s, was it called a green card, or was it a different?
I think so. I think there's different ways they called it in Spanish. I remember they talked about la mica. La mica was a very important thing. It was the lottery, right? If you had one of those, you were golden. Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm.
So he was allowed to stay on, and he was doing work for the railroad at the time?
Yeah, he was working, building railroad tracks. And my grandfather was always a great worker, and he, obviously someone there really liked him a lot, enough to encourage him and tell him. My grandfather never thought of bringing his family here, but someone there just encouraged him and basically walked him through the program. Mm-hmm. And worked with the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City. So at one point, my grandmother took all of her children. This woman from the countryside shows up in the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City and presents these letters that she had no idea what they were, from Union Pacific, and they treated her very well. At the time, Union Pacific obviously was a world-class employer, and they were able to walk out of the embassy with their legal residency.
Sure. So your grandma brings all 10 kids north to the States?
They never came all together.
Okay.
They kind of immigrated slowly. So then my story then begins with my mother. Shortly after marrying, at a very young age, my mother and father immigrate to Los Angeles. Okay. And they start their crazy adventure in Los Angeles. And I was born there. But again, they were, had never stepped foot in the U.S. until they, after they were married, and spent the next, 40 or so years in the U.S. raising us.
But now Los Angeles is a fairly friendly culture for Latinos.
Yes. Yeah, and they didn't spend much time there. They eventually moved to the Midwest. So I spent time in Omaha, spending part of my childhood there. and here in Grand Rapids since I was a teenager.
So what work were your parents doing first in Nebraska, then in Michigan?
You know, in Nebraska, my dad worked in, slaughterhouses. I mean, that was, they both had a, elementary level education, and they worked very hard in different factories. Here in Michigan, my dad spent about 25 years working at what was back then the Bill Maher plant in Zeeland.
Okay, sure.
And so they both just worked, whatever jobs they could, 1 shift, 2 shifts, whatever it took to
Meat
to
processing.
raise. Yes, hard work,
Yeah,
hard labor. I still remember my dad when he started at Bill Maher. After a couple of weeks, he lost all of his fingernails because he was working so hard, in the plant on the line, fast work,
And probably refrigerated environments.
in some areas, yes. But at an early age, and he taught us the value of education, and he used his hard work and mom's hard work as an example of why he wanted his children to get an education.
Sure, sure. And earlier on, you had mentioned that your grandfather, who was the leader, the brave leader in this family migration, was your hero. Can you talk about that?
Well, yeah. I mean, I had the privilege of spending a lot of time with him, and I think he really was the main leader of really the entire family, the patriarch, so to speak, and teaching the value of work and the work ethic, the value that he talked to us about and showed us was really, that's what I think in large part made me who I am today, because of his great example.
Sure. And I'm reminded of this because you said your parents and grandparents did not have high levels of education, and yet their children and grandchildren achieve whole other levels once they get themselves rooted here.
Exactly, Alan. I think like any human being, right? We always want the best for our children, and I think the risks that my grandfather took, and then subsequently my parents, and the sacrifices they made, was because of that dream that they wanted a better life and more opportunities for their children and grandchildren. So absolutely, they sacrificed whatever they needed, took the risks to give their children the opportunity to have that better life. And there's a saying in Spanish that we always talk about, that you want to go to the U.S. to have una vida mejor, a better life. Mm-hmm. And thankfully, thanks to them, that's what I was able to do.
Well, and every parent wants their children to supersede them in some ways along life's line.
Absolutely,
so,
yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this reminds us that there's currently some very short-sighted thinking in terms of who gets to come in currently to the United States, and we're just going to cap it. So unless you have a certain skill set or proficiency, education level, you can't come in. Yeah. But basically, we need motivated, hardworking, good people across the spectrum of work skills, because whatever level they come in at, their children will likely exceed their efforts.
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate how much we've demonized the immigrant today, and it's very unfortunate and sad, and for me, being a son of immigrants, very frustrating. Mm-hmm. So thank you for having a show like this, because we need to tell more stories. Yes, there are bad apples in all segments of society, but I would say the vast majority of immigrants from all over the world share that value, share that American dream, and so they come here hungry. They come here willing to do the hard work, willing to work harder than anyone else. And immigrants have a lot of pride, and they have the same values that the rest of us already here do, right? And so I think it's unfortunate that we don't recognize the value and the energy that the immigrant brings to this country.
Absolutely. Keeping on the theme of work, but switching slightly, you're wearing your work clothes.
Yes.
You work at Herman Miller right now. Talk about the work that you do in diversity and inclusiveness.
Well, I didn't study to do this type of work.
What's your background?
I actually studied finance,
okay.
And the reason why I studied finance was my dad, even though I mentioned he only had a elementary level education, he's a very smart man. He loves to read, and he would always have answers to anything I asked him as a child. But there was one question I remember that he couldn't answer, and that was, whenever the market segment came up in the evening news, and they rang the bell, and today the Dow Jones did this and this, and I would always ask him, like, what is that? And as a child, I remember that was the only thing he just did not have an answer for. And I thought to myself, I'm going to grow up and that's what I'm going to study because I want to know that. But after spending a number of years in finance at Herman Miller, I was really blessed and given the opportunity to lead the company's inclusiveness and diversity initiative. And that basically is, the focus there is ensuring that our company resembles the customers and the markets that we serve all over the world. Even though we're headquartered here in West Michigan, we serve customers all over the world. And so it's important for our company to be able to understand and look like those customers that we serve.
And a lot of international folks who work with Herman Miller, either in sites offshore or who come here to work in the United States for the company,
Yes.
They represent a certain kind of diversity, but you're still headquartered here, and West Michigan is often seen as not very diverse. What are the challenges that presents to you?
Well, I think the challenge is that Herman Miller was founded here, and so the challenge is always to change with, just like your customers are changing, and to accept that we do business all over the world, right? So I think it's important for us to have the talent that can work with and resonate with and connect with people from all over the world. So for me, it's a great opportunity now that I use my background that we've spoken a little bit about to host customers from different parts of the world. Mm-hmm. One time I was having dinner with an important client from Mexico. So what a great story to come full circle and talk about my experience. And it just makes it, as you know, in business, it's so much about relationships. Mm-hmm. So you need people that can relate to people from all over the world. I think that's good for business, and it's also good for our community to make sure that we include all segments of our community here.
And you have the credibility with customers from
absolutely
other
yes.
places, because you
and customers take notice of that. I mean, they know, they can tell if they're doing business with someone that can empathize and that they can relate to. Absolutely.
Yeah. Awesome. So I want to talk about successes, because recently you spoke and Herman Miller hosted an event for the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, and you were talking, and you and some of your team were talking about an academy, a year-long academy that Herman Miller sponsors. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so this really, a few years ago, our CEO, Brian Walker, very passionate about education and the impact that it can make on people's lives, challenged us to come up with a program or an initiative that would help us connect better with our community, and specifically with students that maybe really didn't know what they were going to do or didn't have a good idea. And of course, I often would see myself in these students. So the Academy is basically a partnership with schools that we, specifically at the high school level, that we bring in high school students to Herman Miller for a one-year period. And that includes having a mentorship program for them. It includes a paid summer internship program, and really exposure to different careers, to different leaders, to different people that work there, for them to open their eyes. And we say that our goal is really to help them fulfill their full potential, so that they see that there are so many things that they can do out there, that maybe some of these young men and women maybe have had more challenging backgrounds in their lives. When they feel someone that believes in them and shows them the possibilities, it's amazing what a change and impact that makes on their lives. So our goal of the Academy is simply that, to create those partnerships to help these young men and women fulfill their potential in life, and hopefully come work for us as well. Fantastic.
So we have to wrap up in just a moment, but the theme of our show is belonging. Can you talk about your understanding of the concept?
Well, it's belonging to me is obviously related to acceptance, and I think whether you are in the shoes of the immigrant or you are already here, we know that in this country we are all immigrants. So I think it's belonging for me is feeling the attitude that you're welcome, and that you are equal. I think without equality, you won't belong, and without belonging, we just won't get the full potential of every human being. So I think as a country, as a community, as a society, it's so important to make sure that everyone belongs. because that'll make everyone stronger.
And I think for those of us walking around with feelings like looking over our shoulder, you know, a lot of people here don't accept me. There's no way that I can live up to my full potential because I'm not focused on doing, I'm focused on.
You're so worried about things that don't add productively to your life. And so there's a lot of waste and energy in trying to belong. Yeah. So yes, absolutely.
Awesome. We're going to have to leave it there. The time's flown by, but I really want to thank you for coming by and talking with us
Thanks,
today.
Alan.
You
Great
bet.
to be here.
Yep. Thank you for joining us. If you're watching on TV, stay with us for some tips on American English, culture, and humor. For our friends on the internet, we hope you'll join our ongoing conversation with the impressive immigrants who contribute their vast skills to making the United States a better place.